There we go. Okay. So there's my bio. So hopefully everyone's somewhat familiar with that.
Well, it looks like you're not that one. The other picture looked like you up there.
Yeah, there you go. That's an updated photograph of me. I put that up recently. So we'll be talking about Louisville's Lincoln, local influences that altered Lincoln's presidency and changed American history. So everything that's related to Louisville and Lincoln is part of this conversation today. So here's just the basic information about Abraham Lincoln. Born on February the 12th, 1809. He only had 1 year of formal education. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, which meant he was 1 inch taller than I am. And so some other things that he did. He was only in Congress just for 2 years, and he ran for the Senate twice. So during this period of his Lincoln connection to Louisville, he was dating Mary Todd, who lived over in Lexington, just about 70 miles to the east of where we're at today. And so this was his view of the relationship when he was dating Mary Todd. He was basically saying he doesn't think the relationship is going very well, that he doesn't think she likes him, and they're having all sorts of problems with that dating process. And now here is Mary Todd's impression at the same time. She thought just the same, that she didn't think their dating situation was going well either. And so both of them had sort of the same view.
A question about each other.
Yeah, a question about each other. And fortunately, they reconciled that and got married shortly thereafter.
Oh, yeah.
So here's a little bit about Mary Todd. And she was very educated. 12 years of education. It doesn't say, yeah, she was fluent in French, and I think she was fluent in several foreign languages. She was, how tall was it? Yeah, she was 5 feet 2 inches tall, so she was 1 foot 2 inches below Abraham. Abraham was 14 inches taller than her, if you will. She dated Stephen Douglas as well, along with Abraham Lincoln. And also, and one thing that Lincoln liked about her is she knew the Henry Clay family pretty well. Lincoln was a big fan of Henry Clay, and so that attracted him to her as well, was that political connection. So in one of Abraham Lincoln's best friend was Joshua Fry Speed. Speed was born here in Louisville at Farmington, which isn't too far away. It's over on Bardstown Road. But he moved to Springfield in 1835, Springfield, Illinois, where Lincoln was. And according to legend, they met on April 15th, 1837, when Lincoln came into the store, the merchandise store that Speed operated there in Springfield. Supposedly, Lincoln didn't have a place to sleep or anything. He couldn't afford much, and Joshua Fry Speed took him under his wings and allowed him to stay at his place, and sort of they fostered a relationship on that. And then in 1841, Speed moved back to Louisville when his father, John Speed, passed away. And there's a photograph of Joshua Fry Speed later. That was probably taken at the White House, more than likely by Matthew Brady, the famous White House photographer. Matthew Brady probably took that photograph of Joshua Fry Speed. Again, Speed visited the White House several times to meet with Lincoln. So here is Louisville in 1836. It's 5 years before 1841. 1841 is when Lincoln came here, and the city's population was around 21,000 people. We were the 16th largest city in America. But this was sort of the basic layout of the city. And this is Broadway down here, this lower big street here. And so really Broadway was where the rural area of Louisville was. It was the suburbs. Now, of course, it's way in the inner city, Broadway. But back in 1841, it was part of the suburbs.
It was what?
Part of the suburbs,
Oh.
the rural area, an undeveloped area.
Okay.
So here's a artist rendering of Louisville skyline in 1840, and as you can tell, a lot of low-level buildings, 2-, 3-story buildings. Again, they didn't have elevators or anything like that, of course, so you had to walk up. But yeah, very low-level city, nothing very high or big.
Is that supposed to be a bridge?
That's what Louisville looks like today. It's kind of changed a bit, hasn't it, from over the past, what, 184 years. This is what West Main Street looked like about that same period in the late 1830s. That's what West Main Street looks like today.
I think that looks,
Kind of changed.
I think the other one was prettier.
Yeah.
That building there, that was beautiful, the other one.
Yeah, kind of changed over the past 180 some odd years.
Maybe.
This is 6th Street looking south, and that's what you look at today. So you can kind of see, so this is sort of what Lincoln would have seen, and that's what we see today. Yeah, it's kind of changed. Again, another view of West Main Street, when Lincoln would have been here, what he would have seen.
Horse and buggy.
And that's what we see today. We see Yum Arena.
Oh. Wow.
So yeah, it's kind of changed. Lincoln came here via steamboat, and he went through the Portland Canal. And this is a steamboat going through. This is in the 1830s, so it's very primitive canal that Lincoln would have come through, as opposed to what we've got today with the McAlpin Lock and Dam there.
Oh.
So he would have landed on the wharf area. This would have been the wharf back in the 1850s. You see all the steamboats, the low-level buildings. That's what our wharf looks like today.
That looked like a heart.
Kind of changed just a bit. Oh yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, the clouds
How'd
look
they
like.
get that heart in the sky?
That's how the artist decided to depict it. And so when Lincoln arrived here, he would have come in through downtown Louisville back in 1841, and he would have taken Bardstown Pike. It was a toll road back in those days. He would have rode a horse or a carriage out Bardstown Pike out to Farmington, which is here at the Waterston Expressway and Bardstown Road. So, and that probably would have taken him a good couple of hours to do. Nowadays, it would probably take you 15 minutes to get from the Waterston Expressway to downtown. But back in those days, it probably took you 2 to 3 hours, I would say, to get from downtown out to that location via the old horse carriage method. And here are some of the things that Lincoln would have seen back in 1841 that we still see today. So these things, I'll point them out, that he would have seen. He would have seen the courthouse, which still exists, Actors Theater, which was the old Bank of Louisville, Cave Hill Cemetery, or it was the Cave Hill Farm, Farmington, several historic homes, and all. So there's our courthouse. Lincoln more than likely would have seen this being built. It was built between 1836 and 1860. Him being a lawyer, he would have been interested in the latest courthouse design, so he more than likely checked this out. The old Bank of Louisville, which we now call Actors Theater, he might have actually have gone into this bank and made a money financial transaction. Miller's Cafeteria, which was a notable restaurant back in the 1980s and 1990s, it actually was called the Howard Hardy House, and this is what it would have looked like back in Lincoln's day. So he more than likely might have seen that. Christ Church Cathedral existed when Lincoln was here. Christ Church Cathedral, I think, started around 1820, 1822. And so it would have been built when he was here in 1841, but that's what it looks like today. So it's kind of changed from this historic church to what it is today. But he might have gone to church there, I don't know. Albert Sidney Johnston. Albert Sidney Johnston was a famous Confederate general during the Civil War, And Johnston's relatives, family, owned the land where Cave Hill Cemetery is today. It was called the Cave Hill Farm, but the Johnston family owned that land. So that was an interesting connection that Lincoln would have passed by a Confederate general's location. And by the way, these statues and what you see here, that is Albert Sidney Johnston's gravesite in Austin, Texas. Johnston was killed during the Civil War, and they honored him there in Austin, Texas with this beautiful monument. While Lincoln was here in 1841, it is known that he went around and talked to some of the neighbors of Farmington. So where he was staying at Farmington, he would go out and talk to some of the neighbors. Lincoln was here for 3 weeks. From end of August to early September is when Lincoln was here. He was here because the court system in Illinois was on a summer break. So he had like a 3-week vacation at that time, so he was able to come to Louisville. And one of the neighbors of Farmington was this historic home here called Hayfield, which is on Tyler Lane near Bardstown Road. And he might have gone to the Samuel Bray house, which is there off Bashford Manor Lane and Bardstown Road. So he might have visited this home. And of course he stayed at Farmington. I believe the Farmington people say that he stayed in this front left room here is where his bedroom was while staying here in Louisville. We have a nice statue down on the waterfront of Lincoln. There it is. It was dedicated about 15 or so years ago, 15, 20 years ago it was dedicated. And it has a number of these plaques which talk about Lincoln's life. Each of these monuments or plaques, tablets, gives some sort of historical reference to what Lincoln did in his life. And one of the plaques talks about slavery, and that was one of the key things when Lincoln came to Louisville. He got to experience slavery on a first-hand basis. In Illinois, they had no slaves. It was a free state. And so when he came to Louisville, the Farmington plantation had slavery on it. So he got to experience it firsthand. It really deeply impacted him. He also got to see slaves being shackled on boats being sent down the river, on the Ohio River to the Mississippi. So he talks about it in numerous documents about how it impacted him when he came to Louisville and saw that horrible condition that the slaves were within. Downtown Louisville, we have some historic markers talking about the slave trade there, and the very horrible institution that it was. There's another, the Otterburn brothers had a huge slave pen there where they kept slaves, and they would sell them down, I hate to use the term sell them down the river, but that's exactly what they did. And Lincoln got to see all this while he was here, and it really impacted him about his view of slavery once he saw this. This is a plaque on the Civil War, which of course was fought to end slavery, and Lincoln was very much involved in all that. And this is a plaque depicting the Civil War, which is down at the Lincoln on the waterfront there. Now, one thing a lot of people don't know, but Lincoln had a military background. He fought in the Black Hawk War of 1832. And the Black Hawk War took place in Illinois and Michigan. It was kind of a, I hate to use the word do-nothing war, but it only lasted 3 months. It was fought over a lot of misinterpretations between the Native Americans and the Americans. It really was a war that should never have been fought for various misrepresentations, but there were several battles, and Lincoln, I don't think Lincoln actually served in a battle. He was just in the Illinois area, but he was in the Army during that period of 1832. He would have been, let me see, he was born in, he would have been 23 years old at the time. But what's most important about the Black Hawk War, several other people served in that war. Robert Anderson, Jefferson Davis, Zachary Taylor, and Albert Sidney Johnston. So those 4 other folks interacted with Lincoln in various ways, and I'll explain that here shortly. But so even though it was a short-lived war, it had great impact on Lincoln when he became president, especially with those individuals that he served with during the war. One of them was Zachary Taylor, former president who is buried here in Louisville, over off Brownsboro Road. This is his mausoleum here. That's where he lived there in Louisville. And of course he was in the Black Hawk War and various other military engagements. He was a general in the U.S. Army. Jefferson Davis visited Louisville. He would be the future president of the Confederacy, and he actually got married to Zachary Taylor's daughter. The daughter of Zachary Taylor married Jefferson Davis. And there's a historic marker there near Zorn Avenue and Brownsboro Road that talk about it. Zachary Taylor's daughter was named Sarah Knox Taylor, and she married Jefferson Davis in 1835. So that's very ironic, if you will, that Jefferson Davis was here in Louisville and married a future president's daughter, as Sarah Knox. Unfortunately for Sarah Knox Taylor, on the honeymoon with Jefferson Davis down to Louisiana, she got malaria and died shortly thereafter. So very sad. Yeah, died on her honeymoon. And Zachary Taylor did not like the marriage at all. He did not like Sarah marrying Jefferson Davis, primarily because Jefferson Davis was in the military, and Zachary Taylor knew how hard it was on wives to be married to military people who are constantly on the move and doing things. And so he did not want his own daughter to put up with Jefferson Davis being in faraway lands while she was back home with the kids, quote unquote. So, but anyways, unfortunately Sarah passed away on her honeymoon down in Louisiana. Now, one of the key figures in all of this with Lincoln's connection to Louisville is Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson was born here in Louisville, just out off of Hurstburn Parkway, at a historic home called Soldier's Retreat. And his father, Richard Anderson, was in the Revolutionary War, and then Robert, the son, was in the Civil War. This is a Soldier's Retreat in the lower left-hand corner there. And Robert Anderson was the commandant, was the commander of Fort Sumter when it was fired on by the Confederacy to start the Civil War. So Anderson was right at the start of the Civil War. There was a great book, and I'm not sure if you've got it in your libraries yet. It just came out recently. It's called The Demon of Unrest. If you're into reading books, I highly recommend, and you're into history and biographies and all that, great book to read. It's by Eric Larson, and it talks all about Robert Anderson, who's from Louisville, about what he did there at Fort Sumter, and a lot of information as well about President Lincoln and what he did during the Civil War. So if you're into books, highly recommend this to get a little bit more information about these connections to Louisville. A number of years ago, visited West Point, New York, and got to visit Robert Anderson's gravesite there at West Point, which is the military academy. Anderson has one of the more prominent headstones and grave sites there at the military academy.
You've had a pretty time.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, it looks like it was springtime, I guess, if I'm looking at the trees. By the way, I went to, in search of Robert Anderson's gravesite, I went to Arlington National Cemetery thinking, of course, he's buried at Arlington, right? So I go up to the information desk and I ask, you know, where's Robert Anderson, the hero of Fort Sumter, Civil War and all that? Where's he buried at here in Arlington? And the man behind the desk goes, well, you've got to give me his death date and more information because we have over 300 Robert Andersons buried here in Arlington. So my antenna went up and I said, I got to do more research. And I subsequently found him buried at West Point. By the way, I want to point out this obelisk, this other monument right near Robert Anderson's gravesite. That is the gravesite of George Custer, who was there at the Little Bighorn, who was killed at the Little Bighorn with all of his men. And you might say, well, how did George Custer get relocated from the Little Bighorn to West Point, New York at the military academy? Well, it's my understanding, by the way, I'm not sure if y'all have been to the Little Bighorn. It's really dramatic to actually see how that battle happened. And all of the soldiers are still buried out there. But all the officers got reburied to wherever their family wanted them buried at. And so George Custer got brought back to the academy here at West Point. And on this plaque, it said that all in his command were lost.
Oh.
And there was over 200 men that were killed in that battle. And I think this was serving as a warning to the military cadets: do not lose all your men in battle. You know, it's sort of a warning about that. But anyways, George Custer is buried almost right next to Robert Anderson there at West Point. James Speed, who was the brother of Joshua Fry Speed, became the Attorney General for Abraham Lincoln. James Speed, also born at Farmington from Louisville, became Attorney General, and he helped prosecute some of the people involved in the plot to assassinate President Lincoln. So James Speed was connected to Lincoln in that manner. James Guthrie, who is a very prominent civic booster of Louisville. This is his gravesite in Cave Hill Cemetery. James Guthrie was a very prominent person here locally, and he served in the cabinet of Franklin Pierce, who was a president of the United States. I think he was Treasury Secretary, if I want to say that correctly. But Lincoln also wanted him in his cabinet as well, but Guthrie said, I'm a little bit too old for that, and he passed on being in Lincoln's presidential cabinet. But Guthrie from Louisville. At Cave Hill Cemetery, we have a national cemetery there. Most of the soldiers that are buried there served in the Civil War. And of course, every Memorial Day and Veterans Day and all, they put the flags out on the grave sites there. And one other little ironic thing about Cave Hill Cemetery, they also have a Confederate section, and they put out Confederate flags, or they used to. I'm not sure if they still do, but they have over 200 Confederates that are buried here in Cave Hill. Primarily, they died at the prison here. The Union soldiers would capture Confederates, bring them to Louisville, where we had a huge prison at 10th and Broadway, and the Confederates would die of either illness or at the end of a rope. And so they were buried here at Cave Hill as well. And one other interesting thing, if you ever go to Cave Hill, you'll see that the Union gravesite has a curved top to it. The Federal gravesite has curved top to the headstones. And the Confederates, you see 3 of them right here, have what we call a pediment style head top to it. It's a pointed top. But a lot of these Confederates are buried with the Union symbol. They've got a curved top to them. Again, they were buried by Union, so the Union put headstones there of the Union. Well, nowadays, via genealogy, a lot of the Confederate descendants come to Louisville, and they're kind of shocked that their ancestor is buried under a Union symbol, so they will install newer Confederate-style headstones there. So anyways, a little trivia there for you between Confederate and American headstones. One of the interesting folks that are buried there is Elizabeth Timms of Calhoun, Georgia. She's the only woman that's buried there with the Confederate men. She was captured by Sherman's troops as they were marching through Atlanta. Elizabeth Timms helped several Confederates on her farm escape from Sherman's troops, and so Sherman ordered her to be sent to the prison up in Louisville, and she died of illness at the prison. Her husband, when he returned from the war to their farm in Calhoun, Georgia, never knew whatever happened to his wife, and a newspaper article appeared talking about her being buried up in Cave Hill Cemetery. So that's how he found out what happened to his wife. And so it's Elizabeth Timms, and on her headstone it says, "Bury me with my people." Governor Thomas Bramlett, he was governor of Kentucky at the time during the Civil War. him and Lincoln did not see eye to eye very well, but he's buried in Cave Hill also. And then I thought this was interesting. There's a little boy buried there in Cave Hill Cemetery. His name is Ludwig Abraham Lincoln, and his dates are 1861 to 1865, which are the exact dates of the Civil War. So I thought that was an interesting connection. Unfortunately, kind of a sad connection, but he was named for Abraham Lincoln, yeah. Andrew Cowan, major hero of the Civil War, lived in Louisville. He actually was born over in Scotland, over in the British Isles. His family moved to New York when he was a young kid, but he then volunteered and got involved with the Union and the Civil War when he lived up in New York. And at Gettysburg on July 3rd, July 4th, somewhere in that neighborhood, he was of 1863 when they had the Gettysburg battle. He was right in the middle of Pickett's charge, the very famous Civil War battle, as the Confederates charged up the hill there. I think it was Cemetery Ridge. Andrew Cowan and his cannon battery was there at the top of the hill, and he told his men to don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes. And so as Pickett was charging up the hillside there, Cowan had his cannon folks obliterate the Confederates as they came up. So he was a hero at Gettysburg, and this is a little bit of discussion here talking about Andrew Cowan and his bravery that day. And he was literally right here, right in the middle of all that action. Bullets were whizzing by him. I think he even had one or two bullet holes into his uniform from bullets going by, but he was never hit. And there's this nice monument to him and his men there at Gettysburg. Let's see what else I got here. The New York Times, when Cowan died, did a nice obituary for him and talked about his heroism at Gettysburg. There's his gravesite at Cave Hill Cemetery. There was a book written about him as well, talking about his men and what he did at Civil War. That's a photograph of Cowan's men, the cannons, and this is Cowan here on the far left, right there during the Civil War. Cowan, after the war, would go up to Gettysburg for the various reenactments that they had there. This is when he was there. And again, the monument that you see there that talks about Cowan and his men at Gettysburg. After the war, Cowan came to Louisville to seek his fame and fortune. He was a leather goods merchant, which meant he dabbled in leather goods from the, we have the stockyards there where we have a lot of cows and pigs and all that kind of down there at the stockyards. He would get their leather and make various things from it, like boots and belts and saddles and anything that could be made out of leather. Cowan's company did. And he became a very big advocate for civic projects here in Louisville, and one of them was the Olmsted Parks project. And so here's Olmsted Park. This is Cherokee Park. And Cowan built his house right here. This is Big Rock, if anyone knows where Big Rock is at Cherokee Park. So his house overlooked Big Rock there at Cherokee Park. So Cowan came back to Louisville and got very much involved in the park system. One of the big battles in Kentucky during the Civil War was known as Perryville. Perryville is down south of Danville, Kentucky, and sort of south central Kentucky. And every year on the anniversary of the battle, which was October 7th and 8th of 1862, they would have a major reenactment of that battle. And I went down there one year. It's very dramatic. I don't know if anyone has been down there for this, but they have Confederate soldiers, Union soldiers. It is quite the scene. Look at this. Yeah, it is quite the battle. I can already see some reenactors laying out here in the field. They've already had one battle, and some of them got lost, it looks like. But
Wow.
and what's interesting about this battle, it happened very early in the morning. They started firing like at 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. It was pitch black, and all you could see was just the rifle fire, the fire coming out of the barrels of the gun. I don't even know how they could see who they were shooting at. It was so dark. But yeah, there's more images from the Battle of Perryville. And Perryville is sort of our Gettysburg here in Kentucky. It was our major battle. What was happening is the Confederates were coming up from the south trying to overtake Kentucky. We were an independent state during the Civil War. We were neutral, but the Confederates wanted to capture Kentucky, and but the Union repelled the Confederates there at Perryville. And so here you can see early morning, there's all this fog. You can see the flames coming out of the guns. It really was something to see. So another part of the Civil War, U.S. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, and William Sherman visited the Louisville on several occasions. Sherman was actually based here in Louisville at the start of the war, and U.S. Grant, he would come through Louisville on various occasions. And one of them was on March 19th, 1864, when they stayed at the old Galt House. And there's some folklore out there saying that that's when they planned the march to the sea, when Sherman planned his march to Atlanta and on over to Savannah. But as I say there, how factual is that? Well, it's not very factual, because they came in very late the evening before and left very early the next day, so there wasn't a whole lot of planning involved with that. In fact, numerous other cities like Cincinnati and several others also claim that Grant and Sherman planned the march to the sea at these other cities. So anyways, not quite there. So here is the timeline of U.S. Grant when he was moving around, and he was here on March the 19th, but as noted, very doubtful that he planned the march to the sea here in Louisville. Another good connection to the Speed family, I already talked about Joshua Fry Speed and his brother James Speed, but there was another Speed called Thomas Speed, and he was a cousin to James and Joshua. And he was in the Union Army, and he was actually on the staff of General William Sherman when they went on the march to the sea. And he did various other things. This is his grave site in Cave Hill Cemetery also. One other interesting person connected to Lincoln, believe it or not, James Wilkes Booth was in Louisville in January of 1864. Can you believe that? And he performed at what's known as Wood's Theater. It's down at the northeast corner of 4th and Jefferson. It's where our convention center is today. But the question is, why would Booth have come all the way from the northeast to Louisville? Why would he be performing here? Well, there's some allegations that Booth actually was a spy, and he was sent here to observe what the Union troops were doing in this area. And so maybe that's what he was here for. But he was here for several weeks performing down at the theater. John Castleman, very famous Louisvillian. He was also in the Confederate Army, served for about 2.5 years. He was captured up in Indiana. He was not really involved in any major battles of the Civil War, but he was captured and was sentenced to be hung up in Indianapolis. But one of his relatives knew Lincoln pretty well and was able to get a stay of execution from Lincoln to save Castleman's life. Castleman later came back to Louisville and helped start our park system, and there's a whole variety of things about Castleman later. But he was not only was in the Confederate Army, he was also in the U.S. Army. He was a general in the U.S. Army and only a major in the Confederate Army. Henry Watterson, the famous editor of the Courier-Journal, he also was a Confederate, believe it or not. He was not in the Union. He was down in Tennessee. I think he was born in Tennessee. Henry Watterson claims to have attended both of Abraham Lincoln's inaugurations. So here is Lincoln's first inauguration in 1861, and you can see the mass of people. So Henry Watterson said he was there that day when Lincoln got inaugurated. I think it was on March the 4th, 1861, if my memory serves me right. So here's a good example. What if Lincoln never lived? There is a possibility that Lincoln would never have lived because of what happened here in Louisville. What do you mean by that? Well,
Our history would be different.
definitely would be much different. So out at Long Run Cemetery, you have a headstone out there. It's called Abraham Lincoln, 1738, 1786. He was the grandfather of Abraham Lincoln. And he was killed during an Indian attack out near Middletown, Kentucky, just out Shelbyville Road here. During that attack, the grandfather had his 3 sons out there, and one of them was Thomas, who would eventually become the father of Abraham Lincoln. But the 3 boys fought off the Indians. The grandfather was killed, but the 3 boys survived. And so just what if the Indians had killed everyone that day, even Thomas? Would there even have been Abraham Lincoln?
Oh, it is Long Run
So,
Cemetery.
Long Run Cemetery is out, it's way out near Middletown, Kentucky. I've been out there, but it's been many years.
Oh,
One other connection out there, buried at that same cemetery, is the ancestors to Harry Truman. Harry Truman, the president in the 1940s, early 50s. His grandparents and some of his family lived out near Middletown also, and were buried out in that same general area as Abraham Lincoln that you see there.
Lincoln.
Yeah. Now, how they changed the name and how they spelled their names, who knows back in those days.
yeah, Lincoln's birthday.
Of course, we have a great remembrance of Abraham Lincoln at Hodgenville, the Lincoln birthplace there. Do you think this log cabin's the actual cabin he was born in?
Yeah.
Yeah, not quite. Yeah, it's just a recreation, if you will. And they really don't know where he was born there in Hodgenville, along a creek someplace. But anyway, he was born there at some point. Mary Todd Lincoln's house is still there in Lexington. And of course, the Lincoln homestead there in Springfield. I've actually been to that home there in Springfield, Illinois. Very beautiful, very nice, very upscale home that he lived in Springfield.
Who lives there now?
It's a national park. It's open for visitors. And so he came a long way from the log cabin to this
Yeah.
house here, wouldn't you think?
Yeah.
Oh, right, yeah.
I guess Lincoln cut those the trees down.
Yeah, someone did for him. So here is Lincoln's path, how he lived and where he was at. So again, he was born in Hodgenville. Then he moved over to southern Indiana. There's an area over there, the Lincoln Farm and all. I've actually been there also. Then he goes to Illinois and lives there for a while. Again, he comes back to Louisville in 1841. He visited Lexington several times, 1847, 49, and 50. I think 1849 is when he married Mary Todd. And of course, he was in Washington, D.C. several times. Someone's got a phone call coming in. If we can get there, you go. And so this is sort of all his travels. One interesting thing is that when he was inaugurated or won the presidency, he had to travel from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C., and along the way he made various stops. He actually went through Cincinnati, Ohio, but he never came back to Kentucky because he was warned that if he ever set foot in this state again, he would be shot. There were a lot of people out to kill Lincoln back in those days, and if you read that book that I referenced about the Demon of Unrest, if you read that book, it talks about a lot of the plots against Lincoln that they were trying to kill him, and unfortunately they succeeded later on. But anyways, this is where Lincoln travels were. So to summarize all of the connections to Louisville, he was best friends with Joshua Fry Speed.
Speed, yeah.
James Speed, the Attorney General, Thomas Speed, connection there, Robert Anderson, who was the commandant at Fort Sumter, Zachary Taylor he knew, Jefferson Davis, John Wilkes Booth was here, Albert Sidney Johnston, and that whole connection, the grandfather who was killed out at Middletown, Andrew Cowan, and then John Castleman. So here in Louisville, we had a lot of connections to Lincoln and really influenced his presidency due to all of that. So thanks for attending. Any questions on that?
No, that was really good
Okay.
information.
Well, let me